Hi, my name is Dan and I'm one of the DT evangelists here at Digital-Tutors. In this video, we're going to look at a question from one of our users on how to better understand what has an effect on our render speeds. So for just about any project, render times are always going to be a strong player into many decisions. For example, techniques such as normal maps and bump maps are really just ways to fake details on our models because they don't take nearly as long to render than it does if we left those details in the geometry. Now, as you can imagine, you can create just about anything within Maya. So from modeling entire cities to complex dynamic simulations, there's really no limit to what can be done. And because of the sheer number of variables that go into any given scene within Maya, it can be very difficult to be able to tell with pinpoint accuracy exactly how long a render is going to take. And this is especially true if you factor in that every computer is different and the result that can handle renders with a different rate of effectiveness. So let's take a look at a few common things that can really start to increase our render times. Now, one of those is going to be the actual resolution of our rendered image. So if we come into the render settings here, and under the Common tab, if we scroll down, we'll find the image size. Now we do have some presets here. So obviously if we were to want to render out something like a 4K image or maybe even an HD 1080, which would be 1920 by 1080, that would take a little bit longer to render out than it would if we were to render out something smaller, because the system has many more pixels in order to have to deal with in the scene, or in the final image rather. Now there's a couple other things that we want to keep in mind when we're rendering out. And one of those is, if we come into the quality here, we have the ability to adjust our sampling. Now, anytime that we were to increase samples, it's going to increase our render times. Now, it is going to give us usually a better quality render, but it does that at the sacrifice of a higher render time. So if I were to bring this down, we can see that Maya is telling us that it's going to at the least have a sample, one sample per 16 pixels, or one sample per 4 pixels, or if we crank this all the way up, it's going to have anywhere from 16 to 256 samples per pixel. Now this is for the overall scene. There are also sampling on some metal ray materials as well as various places throughout materials and in the render settings as well. And each time we increase samples, it's important to keep in mind that while it does increase the quality, it is going to also cause our render times to increase. And if we crank it up really high, it can really start to increase our render times very significantly. Now, a few other things that are very common that we might be adjusting and that can increase our render times are things like accuracy. So if we come into our indirect lighting, if we had global illumination turned on, our accuracy, if we crank this up, that will increase our render times pretty significantly. Similar to the samples, it will increase the quality of our global illumination because it does increase, as we can see, Maya is telling us it increases the quality there, but it does that at the expense of higher render times. Same is true if we had caustics enabled. If we crank up the accuracy there, that will increase the quality of our caustics, but it does that at the sacrifice of higher render times. And the same can be true if we kind of come through some of these other rendering methods, if we may be using them for the importons. If we increase the density, that can increase our render times. Final gathering, we have accuracy once again. It's going to increase our render times pretty significantly if we start to crank this up. Coming down, we have irradiance particles as well as ambient occlusion that actually have a number of rays that we can cast, and if we increase that number, it's going to increase our render times as well. So this is just a few things to keep in mind when trying to determine how to better optimize our render times. Now, if we notice that something like a batch render is taking longer to render than our render preview, it's likely that we have a few things that are being computed in the batch render that aren't being computed in the render preview. So for example, if we were to close out of this here, and if we look in the render layers here, we actually have a couple different render layers set up. Now a render preview, if I were to take a render preview of this, And let me kind of resize this so we can see a little bit easier here. Oops. Go ahead and resize this so we can see this. As we can see, it took about 1.5 minutes in order to render out this render layer with the render preview. Now, if I were to switch my render layer, say to this one here, if we take a look in this render layer, I have a few additional objects as well as actually some hair in here that is not going to be computed with the render preview when I have this render layer selected. So depending on which render layer we have selected, our render times may vary. So as we can see, by rendering out this render layer, it took quite a bit longer than it did for rendering out this render layer here. And the only difference between these render layers is actually that I just have a little bit more geometry as well as this hair in the scene. I haven't changed the render settings at all, although we do have things like layer overrides and things like that that we can apply. So that's something to keep in mind if we find that we're having different render times, because a batch render is going to render out all of these different layers, whereas a render preview is only going to render out the one layer that we have selected. So those are just a few things to keep in mind when trying to determine how to better optimize our render times. Now, if you'd like to learn a more in-depth and take a step-by-step approach filled with tons of great techniques for how to set up a photorealistic render, I'd recommend checking out the Rendering Interiors with MORE and Maya course. Or if you're just looking for some in-depth tips on how to better optimize your own renders, then I'd recommend checking out the MORE Tips and Tricks course.